The carriage reached the property at 3:30 in the afternoon, and Abigail Voss did not cry. She had promised herself that much on the morning of her wedding. That whatever came after the ceremony, whatever waited at the end of the road her father had chosen for her, she would not give anyone the satisfaction of her tears. She had kept that promise through the vows, through the brief and wordless carriage ride to the church steps, and through the moment when her husband of 4 hours climbed into a separate carriage without looking back and told his driver to go north. She kept it now, looking out the window at what was supposed to be her home. The house was 3 stories of pale stone, set back from the road behind iron gates that had gone orange with rust. 2 of the upper windows were dark with grime. The garden along the front path had not been tended in what looked like years. The boxwood hedges had grown shapeless, and something that might once have been roses had become a tangle of brown canes pressed against the stone wall. A single lamp burned in a ground-floor window. Abigail stepped down from the carriage without waiting for the footman and stood on the gravel drive and looked at the house for a long moment. Then she picked up her traveling case and walked toward the front door. The housekeeper's name was Mrs. Fenn. She was a stout woman in her 60s with red hands and an expression that seemed prepared for disappointment. She opened the door before Abigail reached it and stood in the frame with a lamp held at her side. "Mrs. Harwick," she said. It was not a greeting so much as an identification. "Yes," Abigail said. "You must be Mrs. Fenn. I received your letter." Mrs. Fenn stepped aside to let her in. The entry hall was large and cold, and smelled of damp stone and something sweet and decaying beneath it. Dried flowers, perhaps, left too long. A staircase rose on the left. Abigail could see dust on the banister, even in the lamplight. "How many staff are there currently?" Abigail asked. Mrs. Fenn seemed surprised by the question, or perhaps by the directness of it. "Myself," she said, "and Percy, who tends the grounds when he's able. He's not been well, that's 2, Abigail said. For a house this size, Mr. Harwick gave instructions before his departure that expenditures were to be kept minimal. The household account receives a quarterly transfer, but Mrs. Fenn stopped. It has not always been sufficient. Abigail set her traveling case at the foot of the stairs and turned to look at the hall. The wallpaper near the ceiling had begun to peel at one corner. The rug beneath her feet was threadbare. The lamp on the entry table had no oil in it. "I'd like to see the house accounts," she said, "after I've settled in." Mrs. Fenn looked at her the way people sometimes looked at Abigail, as though they were recalibrating something. "Of course," she said. She had been brought up in a house where numbers were not hidden from women. Her father, William Voss, had been a shipping merchant with a methodical mind and 2 daughters and no sons, and he had taught them both to read ledgers the same way he taught them to read letters, as though literacy in one and ignorance in the other was a kind of foolishness. Abigail's sister had married a banker and used the skill professionally, in the quiet way women managed things without being seen to manage them. Abigail had spent 3 years keeping her father's books. After his clerk retired, she was 26 when the arrangement with the Harwick family was proposed. She was not consulted so much as informed. The Harwick estate was solvent on paper, but practically neglected. Her father's capital and her own orderly mind were the things being offered. In exchange, a name, a house, and a husband who had made clear, in the one conversation they had before the wedding, that he did not intend to be present for much of the marriage. "I will not pretend this is something it isn't," he had said. His name was Nathaniel Harwick, and he was 34, and there was something in his face that had been closed for a long time. "You will have the house and whatever income the estate produces. I have obligations elsewhere." She had wanted to ask what obligations. She had not. She had looked at him across the parlor of her father's house, and understood that whatever grief or damage lived in him was not something he was going to explain to a stranger, and that asking would only make the distance between them more formal. "I understand," she had said. She had not, entirely. But she had learned that understanding sometimes meant waiting for the thing to become clear on its own. The ledgers were in the study, on the first floor, 3 shelves of them going back 11 years. Abigail spent the first evening after her arrival going through the most recent 3. The picture that emerged was not complicated, but it was ugly. The estate's income came from 2 sources: tenant rents from the farmland to the east of the property, and a quarterly management fee paid by an agency called Alderton and Marsh, which had been contracted to oversee the estate operations since Nathaniel's father died. The income was steady. The problem was the expenditure column, and specifically a line that appeared in every quarterly statement for the past 4 years. Management and administration, Alderton and Marsh, £85. £85 per quarter, £340 per year. For a house with 2 staff and a garden that had not been properly kept since before Abigail arrived. She turned back to the ledger from 5 years ago. The management fee then had been £30 per quarter. She turned to 6 years ago, £22. She set down the ledger and looked at the window, which showed her nothing but her own reflection in the dark glass. Then she picked up a pen and began to write down her questions. Percy turned out to be a man of 60 with a bad knee and an encyclopedic knowledge of the grounds. He knew which drainage channels had been blocked for 3 years and which roof section had been leaking since the winter before last. He knew that the kitchen garden had once produced enough to supply the house entirely and could do so again with 6 weeks of attention. He knew that the Eastfield tenants had been requesting repairs to the stone wall along the road for 2 seasons and had stopped asking after receiving no reply. Who did they send the requests to? Abigail asked. They were standing in the kitchen garden, or what had been the kitchen garden, a patch of earth about 30 feet by 40 that was currently occupied by weeds and a collapsed beam frame. The October morning was cold and clear. To Alderton and Marsh, Percy said. That's who handles correspondence for the estate. And you've never had a reply? Not on that matter, no. Abigail looked at the garden. She thought about the tenants sending letters that went nowhere. She thought about the drainage channels and the leaking roof and the quarterly fee that had nearly quadrupled in 4 years. Percy, she said, do you know where I might find the original contract with Alderton and Marsh? He thought about it. There was a box of papers in the cellar, he said, from when the elder Mr. Harwick was alive. I don't know what's in it. I'd like to look at it, she said. She found the box that afternoon. It was a wooden crate with a warped lid, pushed into the back corner of the cellar behind 2 broken chairs and a dismantled bed frame. Inside were receipts, correspondence, a copy of the elder Harwick's will, and at the very bottom, a contract dated 9 years prior. The original contract with Alderton and Marsh specified a management fee of £20 per quarter. It specified that the fee could be adjusted only with written consent from the estate owner. It specified that all adjustment requests must be submitted in writing and signed by both parties. There were no addenda. There were no signed adjustment agreements. There were no letters of consent from Nathaniel Harwick authorizing any increase. Abigail sat in the cellar with the contract in her lap and the lantern on the floor beside her and read the document 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her skirt pocket and went upstairs to write a letter to her father. The letter she sent to Nathaniel was shorter. She did not know where he was, precisely. He had left an address in London through which correspondence could be forwarded. She wrote to that address and kept the letter to 1 page. She explained what she had found. She attached a summary of the fee increases, the dates, and the amounts. She noted the absence of any signed consent. She said she believed the estate had been overcharged by approximately £1,100 over the past 4 years, and that she intended to request a full accounting from Alderton and Marsh unless he had instructions to the contrary. She signed it Abigail Harwick and sealed it, and gave it to Percy to post. She did not know whether Nathaniel would respond. She did not know whether he would care. She had learned, in the 6 weeks since her arrival, that he was a man who had arranged his life to require as little of himself as possible, and she was not sure whether that was grief or cowardice, or simply a kind of exhaustion she didn't have the context to understand. What she knew was the number at the bottom of the ledger. £1,100 was not a rounding error. £1,100 was a decision someone had made about what they could get away with. She met with Mr. Alderton in November. She had written requesting the meeting, and had received, after a 2-week delay, a reply that was courteous in tone and dismissive in substance. A suggestion that estate matters might be better directed to Mr. Harwick himself, given the complexity of the arrangements. She had written back to say that she was the managing party of the household in Mr. Harwick's absence, and that she would be in the city on the 14th, and would appreciate 30 minutes of his time. He received her in an office on Clement Street that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper. He was a man of about 50 with small eyes and the manner of someone accustomed to being the most patient person in any room. He offered her tea. She accepted it, because refusing would have made her seem combative, and she was not trying to seem combative. Mrs. Harwick, he said, settling behind his desk, I understand you have some questions about the estate accounts. I do, she said. She opened her bag and placed the original contract on his desk. Then she placed her summary of the fee increases beside it. I'd like to understand the authorization basis for the adjustments to the management fee between this contract and the current billing. He looked at the documents without touching them. Something moved through his expression that he controlled quickly. Fees of this nature are adjusted periodically in line with. The contract requires written consent from the estate owner, Abigail said, pleasantly. I've reviewed the files at the house and haven't found any signed consent for these adjustments. I may have missed something. Could you provide copies of the authorization documents from your records? The room was quiet. Outside, she could hear cart traffic in the street. Those records would need to be located, Mr. Alderton said. Of course, Abigail said. I'll leave you my address at the estate. I'd appreciate receiving them within 2 weeks. If there are any difficulties, I'm happy to involve my solicitor. She smiled. I have found it's always easier to resolve these things early. She drank her tea. She set the cup down carefully. She thanked him for his time. On the walk back to the hotel where she was staying for the night, she thought about the expression that had moved across his face when she set the contract on his desk. It had not been the expression of a man confronting a misunderstanding. It had been the expression of a man calculating. She was back at the estate by the 15th. The reply from Nathaniel arrived on the 18th. She had been in the kitchen garden, actually, in it now, her skirts pinned up and her hands in the earth, working with Percy on clearing the worst of the dead growth, when Mrs. Fenn appeared at the gate with the letter. Abigail pulled off her gloves and opened it where she stood. His handwriting was small and controlled. He wrote that he had received her accounting. He wrote that he had not been aware of the adjustments to the fee. He wrote that she was authorized to pursue the matter as she saw fit, and that she could contact his solicitor, a Mr. Brand, if she required legal assistance. At the bottom of the page, in slightly different ink, as though added after, he had written, "You are doing more than I had any right to expect. I am grateful." She read that sentence twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in her pocket, next to where the contract had been, and went back to the garden. The accounting from Alderton and Marsh arrived 3 weeks later, after a follow-up letter from Mr. Brand. It was incomplete and partially incoherent. Figures that didn't align with the dates given, expense categories that overlapped in ways that suggested they had been reorganized in a hurry. Abigail spent a week going through it line by line. She was not a solicitor, but she had grown up in a house where her father came home in the evenings and talked through his business problems at the dinner table, and she had a good sense of when numbers were being made to tell a story rather than report one. She sent her analysis to Mr. Brand with a cover letter that listed the discrepancies in order of magnitude. Mr. Brand, to his credit, seemed genuinely shocked. He wrote back within 4 days to say he was engaging an independent auditor and that the firm of Alderton and Marsh had been informed they were under review. Mrs. Fenn, who had been reading the household mood with the accuracy of a barometer, appeared in the study that evening with a cup of tea and a slice of cake that she placed on the desk without comment. "I didn't ask for this," Abigail said. "No," Mrs. Fenn said, "but I made it anyway." December came cold and clear, and Abigail discovered she did not hate the house. She had not expected to feel anything about it. It had been a circumstance, not a choice, and she had arrived prepared to treat it that way. But there was something about the way the morning light came through the east-facing windows in winter, low and golden and very still, that had begun to feel like something she would miss if it went away. She had learned the house in the way you learn something when no one is there to tell you about it. Room by room, drawer by drawer, the small history of a family that had once been larger than it was now. She found photographs in an upstairs room that had been closed since her arrival. A woman with a direct gaze and a slight smile who appeared in several of them alongside a younger version of Nathaniel, his first wife. She had died 3 years ago, Mrs. Fenn eventually told her when Abigail asked. An illness that had moved quickly. They had been married 4 years. There had been no children. Abigail closed the room and did not return to it. But she understood something she hadn't before. She understood that the empty house had not always been empty, and that the man who had left her here had not left because of indifference. He had left because he did not know how to be in a place that held everything he had lost. She did not pity him for it. But she understood it, and that was different. In January, a second carriage appeared at the gate. Abigail was in the study, going over the kitchen accounts when she heard it on the gravel drive. She looked out the window. The carriage was finer than the one she had arrived in, and there was a trunk strapped to the back. She watched Nathaniel Harwick get out of it. He stood in the drive for a moment looking at the house. She could see his face from where she sat, not clearly, but clearly enough to see that something in it had changed from the man she'd met in her father's parlor 7 months ago. He looked older, and also, somehow, less defended. Then he looked up at the window where she was sitting, and she realized he had seen her. She did not move. She did not wave. She looked at him for a moment, and then returned to the ledger, because there was a column that didn't balance, and she hadn't yet found where the error was. She found it 4 minutes later. She wrote the correction in the margin, and set down her pen and then went downstairs. He was in the entry hall when she came down. Mrs. Fenn had taken his coat. He was standing with his hat in his hands looking at the hall in a way that suggested he was taking inventory, or perhaps remembering one. The hall was different from when Abigail had arrived. The lamp on the entry table had oil in it and was lit. The rug had been beaten and cleaned and was only somewhat threadbare now. Someone, Percy, with her encouragement, had repaired the loose banister post on the staircase. It was a modest amount of improvement, but it was visible. "Mrs. Harwick," Nathaniel said. "Mr. Harwick," she said. She stopped at the foot of the stairs. "I didn't know you were coming. I should have written." He looked at the lamp, at the staircase. "The house it looks better. Percy has been working hard," she said. "And we've been able to redirect some of the funds recovered from Alderton and Marsh toward actual repairs." "Brand wrote to me about the audit," Nathaniel said. "The final amount was £1,460, Abigail said. "Over 5 years, not 4. I found an error in my original calculation." He looked at her. There was something in his expression she did not quite have a name for. It was not surprise exactly, and it was not gratitude exactly. It was the look of a man who had expected very little and was having difficulty adjusting. "Why did you do it?" he asked. The question was plainly meant, she thought. Not rhetorical, not challenging. He actually wanted to know. She considered the question. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said. "And because it was my house, too." The hall was quiet. The lamp made a small sound, the wick adjusting. "I owe you an explanation," Nathaniel said. "About about the way this began." "You don't owe me anything," Abigail said. "But if you want to explain, I'll listen." He told her in the parlor, with the fire going and the curtains drawn against the January dark. He told her about Eleanor, not everything, but enough. He told her about the house in the years after, how it had been easier to be away from it than in it, how the rooms had begun to feel like a kind of indictment. He told her about the arrangement with her father, which had been his solicitor's suggestion, and which he had agreed to with the honest intention of being fair to her without being present for her. "I told myself it was a practical arrangement," he said. "I told myself you understood what it was." "I did understand," Abigail said. "You understood more than I told you," he said. She thought about the closed room upstairs. She thought about the ledgers and the leaking roof and the letters the tenants had stopped sending. She thought about what it meant to leave a house in the care of people who saw the absence at its center as an opportunity. "I think," she said carefully, "that you left because you needed to. And I think that while you were gone, some people decided that need made you inattentive. They were right about the inattention but wrong about the consequences." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "You are very direct," he said. "My father raised me to be," she said. "I've found it saves a great deal of time." He did not leave again. He stayed through February and through March, and Abigail learned that the man who existed, inside the closed-off exterior, was quieter than she had expected, and more observant. He knew the names of the tenants on the East Field without being reminded. He spent 2 days helping Percy clear the drainage channels, and came in afterward with mud on his coat and something looser in his face. He read in the evenings, and sometimes they read in the same room without speaking, and Abigail found she did not mind it. He began asking her questions. Small ones at first. About the kitchen accounts, about which repairs she had prioritized and why. Then larger ones. She answered them plainly, and he listened in a way that suggested he was actually hearing what she said rather than waiting for her to finish. In March, he came to find her in the garden, where she was staking the first of the early growth along the south wall. "I'd like to understand the estate finances better," he said. "Would you be willing to teach me what you've found?" She looked at him. He was standing at the edge of the garden with his hands in his pockets and the late winter light flat and clear behind him. "Yes," she said. "Sit down." There was a wooden bench against the wall that Percy had repaired in December. He sat on it, and she sat beside him with the account book in her lap, and she began to explain. The audit with Alderton and Marsh concluded in April. The firm returned £1,120, not the full amount, as certain expenses were determined to have been legitimate, however poorly documented, and was formally terminated as the estate's managing agent. Mr. Brand recommended a replacement firm with a cleaner record. Abigail reviewed their references before agreeing. She was reviewing the replacement contract at the study desk on the afternoon when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. "There's something I'd like to show you," he said. She capped her pen and followed him upstairs, expecting the roof, which still needed attention on the north side. He walked past the room she had closed in December and stopped at the door of the room at the end of the hall, which she had never been into. He opened it. It was a small room facing south, with a window that looked out over the garden. It had been cleared and cleaned. On the desk by the window was a ledger. A new one, she could tell by the spine, and beside it a pen and a small bottle of ink. "I thought you might want a proper workspace," he said. "One that isn't the middle of the estate accounts." She stood in the doorway and looked at the room, and then at the window, and then at the garden below, where the first of the spring growth was visible along the south wall. "I've been working in the study for 8 months," she said. "I know," he said. "This has a better view." She looked at him. He was standing slightly to the side of the doorway, with the expression she had first seen in January, the one she still did not have a perfect name for. She had begun to think, in recent weeks, that it might simply be the expression of a man becoming unguarded. "Thank you," she said. "It's your house," he said. "You made it that." In May, the kitchen garden produced its first substantial harvest. It was mostly greens, early lettuce, spinach, the first radishes, but Percy brought them in with an expression of vindicated pride. And Mrs. Fenn made a salad that appeared at dinner with a formality usually reserved for much more elaborate dishes. Nathaniel ate it without comment and then said quietly, "This is very good." Mrs. Fenn, who was clearing the next course, permitted herself a small smile in the direction of the wall. Abigail looked at her husband across the table. The window behind him was open to the May evening, and the garden smell came through on the breeze, green in particular and new. The lamp between them was lit. The house was not warm the way it had been before, the way she imagined it must have been when Eleanor was in it. That warmth was not hers to give, and she did not try to replicate it. But it was inhabited now in a way it had not been in years. It was a house where something was growing again. She did not say any of this. She reached for the salt and passed it to him before he asked, because she had learned, over 8 months of careful attention, that he took salt on almost everything. He took it. Their hands did not touch. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her lately, steadily, and with something she was finally beginning to recognize. It was not grief wearing another face. It was not performance or obligation. It was something more tentative than that. The beginning of something that hadn't been named yet, offered across a dinner table in a house that had been empty and wasn't anymore. Outside, the last of the day's light was going. The garden held it for a moment longer than the sky, the way gardens do, catching and keeping the warmth even after the source of it had gone. Abigail Voss had not cried on her wedding day, or on the afternoon she arrived at an empty house with rust on its gates and dust on its banisters. She found, sitting at her own table in the house she had made habitable by nothing more complicated than attention and honesty, that she did not want to cry now either. She wanted to stay.